Welcome to the Shift Report, the podcast from MCentric and the MCentric Foundation. MCentric is the go-to information and resources hub designed exclusively for the emergency medicine community. We regularly host key leaders from the field who share their insights and experience. Our goal is to inform our listeners and to encourage you to use what you learn to improve your practice and improve yourself. To learn more, please visit us at mcentric.org. Today's episode is sponsored by Lotus Clinician Wellbeing. Lotus Clinician Wellbeing provides consulting services designed to prioritize clinician wellness in order to provide the best care for their patients. Lotus Clinician Wellbeing supports healthcare professionals with personalized coaching and consulting services for groups and individuals in areas such as career development, leadership, burnout prevention, practice management, and more. For more information, visit lotusclinicianwellbeing.com. Today, we welcome Resa Lewiss. Dr. Lewiss lives and works in the Philadelphia area. She has a wide range of interests beyond her long history of clinical practice. We will today discuss her work on healthcare design, lifestyle medicine, her new book, as well as your podcast series. Quite busy, Resa. So welcome to the Shift Report.
I am so glad to be with you today.
And thanks for taking the time. You have a lot of things to discuss, and you have your own podcast, so you're quite skilled at this. And I certainly we'll talk about how to find your podcasts, which are quite interesting and entertaining in themselves. But thank you for being our guest today. So you started out in emergency medicine. Kind of tell us about your journey in medicine and emergency medicine, and then how you ended up where you are now.
Sure. So let's see. I grew up in a small town, went to a public high school, and when I went to college, I had a feeling that I wanted to be a doctor. Actually, I was one of those kids that wanted to be a doctor since elementary school. And I loved learning the bones of the body. So when I went to college, I was pre-med, but I didn't want to commit to only studying a science. So I simultaneously studied sociology. And within sociology, I focused on ethno-racial studies. So I was both pre-med as well as sociology concentrator. And together I thought they were perfect for learning to be a patient-focused physician. So after finishing college, graduating medical school, I decided on a residency in emergency medicine because it was that ability to take care of anybody that came through the door. And no matter their age or stage or background or language. And I just thought it was such a great, practical, applicable specialty. And when I graduated my residency in 2001, the opportunity came up to do an ultrasound fellowship. And my mentor at the time said to me, and I just finished a 4-year emergency medicine training program, Resa Lewiss, ultrasound has never gone anywhere and it's not going to go anywhere. Why are you going to do one more year of training in something that's not going to go anywhere? And, there was something that spoke to me. I trusted my gut and I moved to New York City and I was the first fellow in a fellowship class in ultrasound at what is now Mount Sinai, St. Luke's Roosevelt. And I share that because ultrasound obviously did take off. And that's truly how I've navigated my academic career in speaking, in writing, in administrating, and in leading national organizations, ACEP, SAM, SCUF. And it was such an amazing lens to use and to apply while working my way through academic emergency medicine.
So there's a tremendous amount there in growth and history from your time as in sociology expertise, and I think there are probably plenty of amateur sociologists among our colleagues based on what we see, to trusting your gut and going with something that I'm sure we'll touch on in other podcasts, and the ultrasound and really the revolution in ultrasound. Yeah, I think you and I talked about in a prep call history I had of being kicked out of the ultrasound suite as a resident by the by the chief of ultrasound in my hospital, who proudly said he was never going to train anybody other than a radiologist in how to do ultrasound, and that obviously has changed over time. So thank you for your leadership in that. Now you have broadened your reach significantly. And I think many of us, many of our colleagues are looking for ways to develop expertise and broaden their reach. And you have done that in a number of ways. And there are a number of things to talk about. You've got a podcast called The Visible Voices, and tell us a bit about how you started that and where that's going and what your focus area is.
Yeah, thanks for that question. And this will help pull the thread through for the audience that are a little confused about why did she bring up sociology, ethno-racial studies? At the time in college, when the professors in sociology knew that I was simultaneously pre-med, they were very confused. They said, how and why are you doing sociology if you're going to be a doctor? And I knew clear as day that understanding in-group, out-group, the dynamics of people and people as they function based on their identity, my understanding of that historically in the United States and the way people navigate life in America would only help me be a better physician. And no truer than that than to be an emergency physician. So it actually made perfect sense. But then bringing the thread forward to the visible voices during the pandemic, like most of our EM colleagues and friends, I had more time at home. Volumes were down in the emergency department, and many of my shifts became telehealth shifts. So I had time on my hands, and like many of us, I felt very motivated to do something that I thought could potentially make a difference. So, in addition to working main emergency department shifts, telehealth shifts, I started writing outside of academics, more in mainstream outlets, and I started the podcast. So, my first episode was March 2020, and I talked about COVID and what was happening around the world. I had an emergency medicine friend in London and in Geneva and a critical care doc here in Philadelphia. And we all talked about how our cities were preparing. And, fast forward to recently, I dropped my 2024 year-end episode, and it was my 177th episode. And the origin story of the name Visible Voices, because some people have been like, Resa, you can't see a voice. Why'd you say visible voices? And I thought, I'm very well aware that in theory, you can't see a voice. But I had the president, Dr. Bobby Cordano of Gallaudet University, and you're probably familiar with Gallaudet because it's
Yes.
in DC, which is the largest institution for higher education that provides education for the deaf community. So she actually said to me, see, you actually can see a voice. And I was like, touche, you are exactly right. So the origin, though, is that I had seen very commonly in medicine that the people that are the subject matter experts, the people that are really doing interesting things, they're not often who is tapped to be the subject matter expert to speak in front of the grand rounds audience, to be the one on the news, to be the subject matter expert. It often looks and sounds like the same kind of person. Now, understandably, that has changed a bit, thankfully. But even, if we look at the academic literature on salary equity, if we look at the academic literature on who's the first author on paper, so sort of these things that are like the key places and key roles to hold, it's often not truly representative. And so, this concept for me of visible voices, my goal was to amplify people that are subject matter experts, that are doing interesting things, but maybe they're not traditionally, historically getting tapped or being seen as the leader, as the one in charge. And again, it's through the lens of what I've seen in academic medicine and in academic emergency medicine. So I cover the buckets of healthcare, equity, and current trends, which kind of circles back to what you said about the fact that I have many things that I like to do. And I actually say it all goes back to college, where I'm at the end of the day very much a liberal arts geek. Like I love learning. I truly believe the arts and humanities complements the sciences and medicine, and that the better we are and the more learned and read we are in one area helps us be better in our other area. So the current trends piece is sort of, whatever's potentially of interest, whether it's a book, whether it's a James Beard nominated restaurant or something like that. And truly, the conversations focus on health and equity because healthcare medicine is no different than other industries, like whether we're talking law, education, banking, tech startups. This concept of representation and having visible voices is a challenge in almost all these industries. And, I have a very broad definition of healthcare. So, sure, we definitely have physicians on the podcast, but health is not just physical health, it's also mental health, it's also financial health. So, I've had some personal finance experts come on. It's social health, it's civic health. I've had some politicians and people in government come on. So it's just been an amazing opportunity to have smart, inspiring conversations. And I don't have delusions of grandeur. Sure, my goal is to amplify people, but people don't need me. And also, if I can help them along by maybe getting their book sold or maybe getting their movie seen, I'm all in.
That's a great and wide-ranging summary. I mean, there really are, we all are part of a bigger community for good, but we also, as academic physicians or just physicians who just are in practice, face a lot of the same equity and other issues are faced in other parts of life. As we're all painfully aware, nothing changes really quickly. Both watch the evolution of equity issues in medicine and otherwise, with the wheels turning quite slowly sometimes. And I'm sure you see that. You've seen that personally, and your guests see that. So thank you for amplifying that.
Yeah. Thanks for that acknowledgement.
Now, something that we mentioned that we talked about as we were preparing for this, you've chosen to pursue certification in lifestyle medicine. And I think many people don't quite know what that is. There are several boards that are not traditional ABMS boards for one reason or another, but they denote a level of expertise in sort of a non-traditional, maybe that's not the right word, but a non-traditional part of medicine. Tell us a bit about your interest in that, and I assume that the sociology and the economics and other things all play into that.
Yeah, it all really does actually come back to healthcare equity and current trends. So you could argue that lifestyle medicine is kind of trendy right now for anybody that has watched the documentary series on Netflix about the blue zones. This is a little bit of looking at where in the world do people have behaviors, lifestyles that allow them to have true health and long lives, not just for the sake of living a long life, but the actually quality elder years of life. So, lifestyle medicine, there's an American College of Lifestyle Medicine and there's an American Board of Lifestyle Medicine that offers a certification. And the physician track is you have to be board certified in a specialty to then sit for certification for lifestyle medicine. And there are more than six pillars. And also, lifestyle medicine really focuses on six pillars of behavior with the goal of prevention, treatment, and reversal of chronic diseases that we see certainly in American society. And the chronic diseases specifically identified are cancer, obesity, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease. And I thought a lot of this was sort of my notion and my sense, but it turns out there is copious amount of literature and evidence supporting these lifestyle changes. And they focus on intentional sleep, de-stressing, avoiding potentially toxic substances such as nicotine and alcohol, being in community, food as medicine, and movement slash exercise. And, it all makes sense. And there's really, really good science and evidence to support these lifestyle factors for people's health and specifically the treatment, reversal, and prevention of those chronic diseases I mentioned.
Yeah, these are a lot of issues that we hear about more and more in the medical press and the popular press. You mentioned food as medicine, which is a something that many people hadn't really talked about. Some people have been talking about for years, but that's something you can hear about. There's an entire movement on that around the world, and there's no doubt that our diet is suboptimal. There are multiple reasons why we have an obesity crisis. Our diet certainly doesn't help. And that's all, I assume that's all wrapped up. There's also a obesity medicine board that's separate from the lifestyle medicine board, although I can imagine that there are probably a lot of interweaving of the subject matter.
Yeah. And there's a fellowship. Some people are completing fellowships in functional medicine, which is different, but again, there's overlap. And I think what's super interesting is people are like, well, that sounds so different from emergency medicine. But interestingly, the people who from whom I've learned about lifestyle medicine are all emergency medicine physicians. And I think there's an element of we always see people who are maybe at the long-term consequences end of all these diseases and all these behaviors. And I have chosen a life that in general kind of abides by all these pillars. Like I've always tried to be, quote, healthy. And so learning that there's so much literature to support this and, my own motivation of trying to not my own motivation of trying to have quality elder years. I don't think I'm there yet, but I'm aging like everybody else. It's the quality of those years, not just, reaching a certain number, and that there are factors within our control. And that's just it. I think there's this element of agency that people don't realize they have. Plus, I am not at all saying that this is easy. I recently spoke about and have been reading a lot about something called ultra processed foods, which are basically, it's a bit of what they sound like, but these are literally foods that are sold that many of us eat that is essentially chock full of availability when you're traveling in an airport, but it's not something that you would be able to make in your own home. And the negative effects of ultra processed foods in terms of all these chronic diseases just is it's mind blowing, and it's often hard to find fresh plant predominant food options when you're in a restaurant, when you're out in the world, when you're again traveling in an airport. And I think it's become so much a part of our lifestyle that it's actually difficult to not eat in that way.
No, you're right, and I think, and we could delve into the socioeconomics of this all day if we wanted to, but that also speaks to some of the social equity issues. I mean, I don't know exactly where you live, but I imagine it's in a place where there's a reasonable grocery store or several grocery stores within reach, as do I, and many of our listeners do. But as we know, there are plenty of neighborhoods, probably very near to both of us and near to our listeners, that are essentially food deserts, where people who don't have the money or the transportation ability to get to a better place for fresh foods have to shop in suboptimal places and do the best they can, and also buy the cheapest foods they can because that's all the money they have, and that contributes to a lot of the ongoing health problem.
You and I are on the same page. And in fact, I posed this question to Dr. Michael Greger, who has written quite a few books. One is How Not to Die, How Not to Age. And I asked him about this because I think it's really important to keep in mind access and such as healthy, affordable foods. And he said, the best thing is that the cheapest foods are actually the healthiest foods. And he talked about beans and legumes and certain other fruits and things like this. Now, obviously, the organic, inorganic, or the organic slash conventional is argued differently because organic things are almost always more expensive just by putting that organic stamp on it. But
Mhm.
his argument was, we may not think of it that way, but sort of the healthiest foods are often the least expensive foods, but it's just not marketed as such.
No, that's true. And as we go through this, if it were just these things that we've talked about, you do a lot. You've got a long list, but you also have a book, which I think there are plenty of people who talk about writing a book or are told you ought to write a book, but it's not that easy. I'm sure you can tell us. Your book is called MicroSkills: Small Actions, Big Impact. Tell us a bit about the book and what you're trying to achieve with the book, and a little bit about the process of just getting there.
Yeah. I really appreciate the segue. And believe it or not, listeners, this actually makes sense in terms of this ties back into the whole agency. How much agency do we have? Because, training in medicine and being a part of the institution of medicine, of healthcare, of a hospital system, it often feels like we have absolutely positively no agency. Like we have to just follow all the rules, do more ongoing trainings. There's no time to eat, all these things. And I would say one of the underlying motivations for this book is to help the reader and the audience realize that we do have agency even when we are a part of these large, seemingly impersonal workplaces. So going back to my small town growing up and going to college, I actually always identified as a math science person, not as arts, humanity, history, writing person. And I thought, I did enough to write the requisite essay to get me in, but that I wasn't a writer, though that was my other friends. And about 7 years into my academic emergency medicine position, I was applying for other academic jobs. And when I was speaking with someone that was potentially recruiting, he said to me, I PubMeded you and you have no publications. What have you been doing? And it was really crushing at the time because I'm like, what have I been doing? I've been working shifts in the emergency department. I'm leading an ultrasound section. We're doing QA. Like in my mind, I was doing a lot, but I understood and I actually really, really appreciated that the currency that he was looking for was publications. So I made the decision that I really wanted to be a part of academic emergency medicine. And if it meant writing and publishing and learning that currency, I was going to learn it. So I learned how to write for academics. I did reading about how to write. I started becoming an editor for different journals. And I started actually writing with people that had much more experience and asking if I could join them, starting small with case reports, then going to case series, then going to retrospective chart reviews, then going to prospective convenience samples, because that's the kind of work we do in emergency
Mhm.
medicine. It's when people are conveniently in the emergency department for us to enroll them in our studies. But I slowly learned how to write for academics. And I had actually never identified as a person that wrote for mainstream. And quite honestly, bizarrely, it had never struck me that we as physicians could write for the mainstream. Like, sure, there was a sprinkle here, sprinkle there of a physician author that I would see, or, I would start seeing physicians write for a few of the newspapers, but it wasn't as visible and prominent as we see now, thanks to writing programs like the Op-Ed Project, or literally during COVID, all of a sudden there became this boom of physician authors. So it was around the time that I started the podcast, I started writing for mainstream outlets. And those mainstream outlets are like Harvard Business Review, Fast Company, Slate Magazine, and also the Philadelphia Inquirer. And those came from seeing other physicians writing in those spaces. So being like, oh, we can write for those spaces.
Mhm.
But also, I always loved reading those kinds of books like leadership, communication, development, managing a team, because we don't get a lot of training in those spaces. And I find it very interesting. It actually goes back to in group, out group, group dynamics, understanding groups, sociology. And I just found that when people were speaking about their experience in their quote company, it very much, I could translate it to medicine and to an emergency department or to my ultrasound section. So my co-author for the book, she and I started writing articles because even though we have had different life experiences, we've had some overlapping stories of aha moments in emergency physician in the emergency physician world, growing up in medicine, med school, residency, attending ship, fellowship also as well, of like, wow, why didn't someone tell me this? Wow, so why didn't someone tell me this? And I certainly often looked and thought some people just knew how to do things and some people didn't. And some people were given a copy of little sports reference here, like the workplace playbook, and somehow I didn't get a copy. And I thought it was partially because no one in my family is a physician, or it's partially because like it was a mostly male environment, and I was a woman, and like I just wasn't getting the same like inside scoop or tips on the golf course kind of thing. And so we wrote the book that we wish we had when we were starting out. It is sort of a workplace playbook. It's general business self-help, which I didn't even know that was a category. It's for everybody, and it does particularly speak to anybody that has ever had the experience of feeling marginalized in the workplace. I'll stop after first sharing our three truths that we base the book on. Number one, time can only be spent. So we should be very intentional about how we spend our time and with whom we spend our time. Number two, the world is not equal. So it was this acknowledgement that everybody comes to the workplace with different pedigrees, different inherited wealth, different networks, different knowledge. And so we don't all start at the same start line. But by writing a book with giving access to these skills, we're hoping to level the playing field so that it becomes a more equal workplace. And finally, learning is limitless if only it is accessible. And going back to that accessibility, you know, do you have access to the internet? Can you pay for online courses? Can you join a webinar? Do you have time for leisure reading? Or, does your financial situation or your home situation or your family situation require you to go home and work what we call the second shift? Or, the last thing you have time for is to spend time taking and paying for a course online. So, sort of that, creating accessible knowledge and content to help everybody understand the tricks of the workplace. That was our goal.
Those are great lessons for anyone. Those three lessons, and I was writing them down in the old-fashioned way. Those are really great lessons for anyone in any walk of life, professional, personal, or otherwise. And I applaud you for kind of putting the recognizing the struggles of the environment you were in, and then doing something about them, and then writing a book to try to help others, which hopefully it sounds like it should help plenty of others over time, and is I think applicable to many. As you've been writing the book, the mechanics of writing it, what are some lessons you learned just from trying to get it out and get your thoughts and deal with editors and things like that?
So I love this question and I love it because it allows me to share that, if someone said to me, "What do you want to be in life? What do you want?" I have always wanted to be a polyglot. If I could speak 12 languages fluently, I would love that. Now, the truth is, I could probably say a phrase or a word in about 12 languages, but that's about it. I share that because writing and getting a book published is like learning a whole new industry, a whole new language. So it's been super fun, super interesting. So my co-author and I went a traditional route. I did share that we wrote some articles, and like one example of an article we wrote is fuel efficient mentoring. And we talked about how basically now is not the time to take mentoring off your plate. Now is the time to lean into mentoring. And this is during COVID when everybody felt overwhelmed. One other article title I'll share just to talk about these as these were our proofs of concept. We could write together, and the content we were writing seemed interesting to general audiences. It was called How to Get Paid for a Speaking Gig When a Speaking Gig Doesn't Pay. So, again, all these things that you learn along the way. But gosh, if there was content where you could just read it all in one place, you fill in and perhaps save 20 years of life experience. Now, you could argue that it is that life experience that helps that learning, but we really just wanted to provide, as aptly identified, we really wanted to make it easier for people coming after us, no matter what their industry. So we had our articles and they were doing well. And we had lots and lots of ideas for other content to write about based on our lived experience in the emergency department. And she said to me, "I want to write a book." And the nature of our relationship, I'm 15 years older, and we had started as mentor mentee because we're both emergency medicine, we're both ultrasound. And we started writing together when she said to me, do you think I could really develop subject matter expertise as a mentor? And I said, yes. And if you ever want to write something together, let me know. She followed up with me. We started writing those articles. She then came to me and said, "I want to write a book." And I said, "That's amazing. That sounds great." And she said she invited me to write it with her. And I'll be honest, that wasn't even on my radar, writing a book. But yet I love learning. I love learning new languages, as I just shared. And it I had slowly started identifying myself as a writer. Like this woman that had said, "No, I'm math science." Like I'm like, "No, I'm a writer. I'm a writer." So we wrote a proposal and we sent the proposal out to different literary agencies. So this is a very traditional route. We signed with a literary agent. Then the literary agent helps draft redraft, and get your proposal in better order. And then they send it out to publishers. If publishers are interested, they ask for a meeting, and we had quite a few meetings. That was super fun. It was like a 1 hour meeting with them telling you ideas about where they thought the book could go and what they would want to do if we ended up working together. And then there's this special day called auction. And on that day, a certain time, any of those publishers, based on the meetings, who wanted to actually bid to published the book, sent in their bid to the literary agency. And we went to auction. We did 2 rounds and we ended up signing, and our publisher is HarperCollins. And from there, it was about a year and a half. So it was a total of a 3 year process. And our book launched in April of 24. And since that time, it's just continued to be more and more fun.
Well, congratulations on that. And never having authored a book, but having heard about this, 3 years with a really strong publisher is a great effort because many people struggle for much longer than that, don't get attention, get shunted away multiple times. So congratulations on getting through that and on your success as this has gone on.
Number one, thank you. Number two, I'll say, I won't minimize the fact that we work hard, we wrote hard. Sure, there is an element of luck and there's certainly an element of timing. What I think designates our book as different is that a lot of these books say, well, go out and network, go out and find a mentor, go out and, develop subject matter expertise, but they don't actually walk the reader through how to. And as an homage to emergency medicine, in each chapter for each microskill, we actually literally say how to. And so we try to make no assumptions about the reader's knowledge or previous experience.
That's great. This has really been a wonderful conversation. You've made multiple, any one of the contributions you talked about would have been a great contribution to the specialty, but you've made multiple. So thank you on behalf of our listeners for that. And I think this fits in well with our various missions in M-centric focused on wellness and development in the specialty. So I think there's lots of work to do in the future. Tell us again how we can find you and find your book and find your podcast. And it's 170 episodes. Let me remind people that there's a lot to listen to.
So thanks for all those acknowledgments. And again, I'm so appreciative that you invited me to join you as a guest today. I have a website, Resa E. Lewis, MD, and some people like I actually have domain names that'll cover you. If you do Resa Lewis MD, Dr. Resa Lewis, you'll find it. Just Google it. And I have a website that kind of um, talks about the podcast, talks about the book, talks about the writing, and talks about if people want to work with me or meet with me. I'm happy to do something like that if people are thinking about ways to add to ways to diversify their portfolio as an emergency physician. The book is called MicroSkills, Small Actions, Big Impact. It is available through the HarperCollins site. If you like independent books, bookshop.org. Also, it's available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble. It's available through the public library system. And if you have a homegrown independent bookshop nearby you, you can ask them to order it and they can get it as well. My podcast is called The Visible Voices podcast. It's on all the outlets where you may listen, whether it's Spotify or Apple. I'm on YouTube as well. And I drop a weekly episode on Thursdays. Finally, I'll just add I was so delighted when I was selected to be the host for the Academic Emergency Medicine Education and Training podcast. So that's a bi-monthly podcast where I sit with usually the first author of a selected MedEd article. And I've loved that because it allows me to continue discussing medical education, literature, and articles, which is where I've really sort of had my home within academic emergency medicine.
That's great. And thank you for all you've done. And we will certainly put in the messages to our listeners how to find you. So Resa Lewis, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks again. Really loved our conversation.
And thank you for joining us in this installment of our M-Centric podcast series, The Shift Report. And special thanks to Dr. Resa Lewiss for sharing her important insights. For more content, networking, and innovation in the world of emergency medicine, please visit mcentric.org. And another thank you to our sponsor, Lotus Clinician Wellbeing. Learn more at lotusclinicianwellbeing.com.